You know, there's this quote from Lao Tzu, something like, "A good traveler has no fixed plans." It kind of makes you think how unexpected little things can lead somewhere interesting.
Hmm.
Which, well, brings us to today's deep dive. It actually started with something really minor, a slip of the tongue, you could say.
Oh.
Yeah, I recently just said Youth and Sports Day, and the reaction was, well, let's just say intense. I was very quickly told I'd missed out Ataturk's commemoration.
Right. That specific phrasing.
Exactly. And honestly, the idea that my connection to Ataturk would be questioned over like a slightly shorter phrase, it's quite bemusing, really.
It is fascinating, isn't it? How these seemingly small word choices can just blow up, become real points of contention. It shows you the deeper sensitivities, maybe political undercurrents too.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder who gets to be the language police, who decides the right way.
Exactly. And to explore this and some related things happening, we've got some interesting source material today. It's excerpts from a YouTube video transcript featuring a political commentator.
Okay.
So, our mission for you today is really to unpack a few key things that are, well, making waves in Turkish politics right now.
Right.
We're going to look into the fallout from this Youth and Sports Day thing, um, the potentially huge role of Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned PKK leader, as you know, in talks about a new constitution.
That's a big one.
Definitely. And also the ongoing investigation around the Istanbul mayor, Imamoglu, and then this whole controversy about a canceled concert. We'll try and make sense of it all for you without getting bogged down.
And if you look at the bigger picture, I mean, what we're really seeing here is a kind of convergence, isn't it? Events touching on Turkish identity, political games, cultural nerves.
Yeah.
It's all intertwined.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's tackle this Youth and Sports Day thing first. So,
Yeah.
like I said, in a recent chat, I was just trying to be quick, keep the conversation moving,
Yeah.
I said Youth and Sports Day, and immediately there was this backlash online. The problem, not saying the full title, Ataturk's commemoration, Youth and Sports Day. It felt like I don't know, broken some sacred rule.
Well, it does raise that important question, doesn't it? Who gets to define national identity? Who polices it?
Yeah.
And who decides what's, enough patriotism or loyalty?
Yeah.
It shows how rigid some people expect these expressions to be.
Precisely. My intention was just brevity, keep it flowing. But the reaction made it seem deliberate, like I was being disrespectful. And honestly, this constant watching, the implication my patriotism is somehow shaky over a few words, it's really frustrating. The commentator in our source material used a great phrase, boza pisurmek, like someone's hovering, nitpicking every tiny, insignificant detail.
That's a good analogy.
So what this really flags for you is just how intense the scrutiny is around national symbols. Even tiny deviations can be blown up into big political statements.
And what's really significant, I think, is how the commentator connects this very specific sort of micro-level thing to something much broader.
Right. It's not just about a holiday name. It points to this wider trend, Individuals, groups, setting themselves up as the final judges of what it means to be truly Ataturkist or truly religious or even just truly Turkish.
Yeah, like everyone's got their own checklist.
Exactly. Everyone seems to have their own standard, their own measure of who's adhering correctly.
Right. Self-appointed guardians of national virtue, maybe.
Oh.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and talk about Abdullah Öcalan.
Okay.
So news broke recently about a delegation from the Dem Party, a major party, especially representing Kurdish interests, visiting him in Marala prison.
Yeah, I saw that.
And his message was about a new contract, apparently based on brotherhood law. You talk about the historical Turkish-Kurdish relationship, saying its original spirit needs restoring. What are we supposed to make of this?
Well, if you think about the timing, this message lands right in the middle of these very active talks about a new constitution for Turkey.
Right, the Cumhuriyet İttifakı, the AKP and MHP alliance, they're pushing that hard. Exactly. So, the commentator sees Öcalan's words as a signal. A signal that he's becoming an active player in this constitution process. Maybe even, potentially, with some encouragement from the state itself.
Wow, okay.
So the core insight here, for you, is this potential for a really significant political realignment. You've got a figure who was completely ostracized, now possibly being positioned as key in shaping Turkey's future, especially on Kurdish issues and the constitution.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you. The commentator actually goes so far as to suggest Öcalan has effectively become a new partner for the Cumhuriyet İttifakı.
That is a huge claim.
Influencing policy for the Dem Party, apparently. But I mean, is that really plausible? The state actively encouraging Öcalan's involvement, given the history, the nationalist feelings in the country?
It is a significant claim, absolutely. And the commentator really stresses the lack of transparency here. There's no clear public process explaining how this is unfolding, which is, particularly concerning given the incredibly sensitive history of Turkish-Kurdish relations
Mhm.
and the risk of exploiting existing tensions.
Right.
And building on that idea of Öcalan's influence growing, the commentator also mentions worries about the internal dynamics within the Dem party itself,
Ah,
particularly within the Sol Birleşler İttifakı, the Left Components Alliance. They might not be comfortable with this apparent alignment with the ruling coalition. There's even talk of potential splits within the party.
and we also hear about these speculated changes to how citizenship is defined, maybe taking out the phrase, everyone bound to the Republic of Turkey by citizenship is Turkish.
Yes, and replacing Turkish with citizen of Turkey.
That feels subtle, but potentially massive, a shift in how national identity is legally framed. So, I mean, put simply, what would changing his Turkish to citizen of Turkey actually do in practice?
Well, the commentator points out something crucial. Öcalan's communication is totally controlled by MIT, the Turkish intelligence agency.
Right, nothing gets out without approval.
Exactly. Which strongly suggests any message from him has at least some degree of state coordination. That gives his statements serious weight.
Okay.
And furthermore, the commentator actually predicts Öcalan might even back an extension of President Erdogan's term
Really? Why?
to solidify this whole process. The thinking seems to be that Erdogan might be seen as the leader best placed to actually deliver on these potential changes regarding Kurdish issues.
Okay, so given all that, the commentator sounds pretty skeptical about whether a new constitution is genuinely needed right now, or even about the quality it might have.
Very skeptical. Yeah.
They point to the government seemingly ignoring the current constitution, the judiciary losing independence, power concentrated in the presidency. It makes you wonder if new document would actually change anything on the ground.
The commentator basically argues the real need isn't for a new constitution document, but for a genuine commitment to, separation of powers, proper checks and balances within the system we have.
Things they doubt Erdogan and Maseli really want.
Precisely. Principles they doubt the current leadership truly supports. They see Erdogan's push for a new constitution as mainly driven by his own need to extend his time in office.
Right.
And he's trying to kind of align that personal goal with the perceived needs, or maybe desires, of the Kurdish population.
Okay. Now let's move to the Dem party's recent activities. They've been doing this political tour, visiting the Welfare Party, Rifa, and the Felicity Party, Saadet.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Devlet Bahçeli, the MHP leader, he proposed setting up a parliamentary commission to tackle these complex issues we've been talking about.
Right.
And the Dem party seems to be on board, saying they support a fully authorized commission. What could this mean? Any potential implications?
Well, the commentator suggests one way to read it is as a potential strengthening of Parliament, the legislative branch.
Which some feel has been weakened recently.
Exactly. So it could signal a move towards a more inclusive political process.
Yeah.
At least, in theory.
But the commentator also sounds uncertain about the real purpose of this commission, especially thinking about those discussions around PKK disarmament.
Yeah.
They're asking, what exactly would this commission be negotiating? What would they vote on if the core issue, disarmament, is maybe already decided?
It's also worth noting, as the commentator does, that we haven't seen any clear, concrete support for Bahçeli's idea coming from the AKP side.
Okay. That's interesting.
Which naturally makes you wonder about President Erdogan's actual intentions. Is he really behind this idea from his coalition partner?
The commentator speculates Erdogan might actually be hesitant. He might not want all the details of this process widely known because of potential public backlash.
Makes sense.
They mentioned specific things that might come up in a commission, like allowing PKK leaders to relocate after disarmament, maybe? Or releasing imprisoned Kurdish activists.
Very sensitive topics.
Exactly. Things Erdogan might prefer not to have debated extensively in public.
And Numan Kurtulmus' recent mention of the parliament is also seen as significant here.
How so?
The commentator reads it as Bahçeli basically putting the ball in the parliament speaker's court, kind of forcing Erdogan's hand, making him formally respond to the proposal.
So the commentator seems to lean towards Erdogan maybe deliberately delaying this or even subtly undermining the whole commission idea.
That seems to be the leaning, yeah. which could suggest, different approaches or maybe even tensions between the two coalition partners.
Right.
They also float the possibility that this commission maybe over time could morph into something bigger, a platform for broader constitutional talks, perhaps even pulling in the opposition parties.
And Özgür Özel, the main opposition leader from CHP, he has talked before about needing a new constitution.
He has, which adds another layer, doesn't it?
So the commentators are wondering, is this commission idea a strategic way to ease the opposition into the whole new constitution discussion? Maybe make them complicit in the process.
And the commentator seems to think, yeah, that probably is the strategy. An attempt to bring the opposition into the fold on the Constitution.
But they still sound pretty skeptical about whether the opposition joining in would actually achieve much.
Right. Skeptical about the benefits. If the fundamental issue, the highly centralized one-man regime, as they call it, isn't genuinely tackled in any new constitution.
Yeah, it raises that crucial point, doesn't it? Real reform versus just sort of symbolic inclusion in the current setup.
Exactly.
Okay, let's switch gears completely now. Let's look at the investigation into the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, the IBB.
Okay, the İmamoğlu investigation.
Right. So this guy, Ahmet Şişek, was arrested. And apparently, trying to get leniency, he gave testimony about iPhones supposedly being distributed during the CHP party Congress.
iPhone.
Yeah. The claim is this other guy, Murat Kapkan, gave Şişek 7 iPhone 16 Pro Max phones instead of cash payment.
Okay.
And Zizek supposedly believes these were leftover phones meant to bribe delegates, sway votes for Özgür Özel at the Congress.
Right. But hang on. iPhone 16 Pro Max. When was the CHP Congress again?
November 2023.
And the iPhone 16 Pro Max, wasn't that only available for pre-order in, September 2024?
Exactly. That's the point the commentator jumps on immediately. The timing makes the claim factually impossible. It just completely blows up that piece of testimony.
Wow. Okay. So that pretty much sinks the informant's credibility on that point, doesn't it?
Totally. The commentator's take is this makes the informant look like a fabricator, damaging their credibility across the board.
Yeah.
They even say, almost sarcastically, that CHP and Mayor İmamoğlu should maybe thank the pro-government media for highlighting such an easily debunked claim.
Because it makes the whole investigation look weak.
Exactly. It undermines the believability of the entire thing. The commentator feels these supposed supporters of the government line are accidentally helping İmamoğlu.
How so?
By showing the low level of intelligence or journalistic care involved in pushing these allegations. The commentator even wonders if some people might actually be trying, maybe without meaning to boost İmamoğlu's image as a victim of a totally baseless smear campaign.
That's an interesting thought.
And they also point out the potential fallout for the prosecutors relying on such obviously flimsy information.
Yeah, that could backfire on them.
If the case's credibility just evaporates because of things like this, the prosecutors themselves could end up facing public criticism, maybe even political feet down the line.
The sheer absurdity of the iPhone claim, the commentator argues, helps create this wider feeling that the entire case against İmamoğlu is just made up.
Right. It's such a glaring mistake. It casts doubt on everything else.
It does. It's hard to ignore something that blatant.
Of course, you could argue that, well, however outlandish it seems to us, maybe some people will still believe these kinds of allegations.
That's possible. And this is where the commentator brings in the role of opinion leaders.
Yeah.
Writers, journalists, prominent voices.
Ah, right, their influence.
Their argument is, if these influential people don't find the claims credible, then the general public is much less likely to buy into them either. Exposing such obvious falsehoods can really shift public opinion against the official narrative.
And actually, the commentator mentions a recent poll suggesting a big majority, something like 67%, think İmamoğlu is being unfairly targeted.
So that suggests the accusations aren't really sticking with the public.
It seems that way. And the commentator also brings up other allegations that fell apart, like supposed discoveries of loads of vehicles in a garage or these unverified claims about bribes and big sums of money. It all adds to this picture of, perceived manipulation and inconsistencies.
It's really interesting, isn't it? How simple, easily checkable falsehoods can sometimes get traction, but then how their exposure can boomerang and just undermine the whole story they were meant to support.
Definitely. Okay, finally, let's turn to this controversy around the Israeli singer Lynette. Her concert got canceled.
Right, due to protests by anti-Israel groups.
Yeah, and she cited safety concerns, apparently even appealed directly to President Erdogan and the First Lady for help. And this whole thing seems to have sparked quite a debate, even within the ruling AKP party.
The commentator definitely highlights that. Clear splits within the AKP on this. Some members, some supporters, were sympathetic, supported her right to perform.
But others reacted strongly against it.
Very strongly. For instance, Nasi Bostancha, former senior AKP MP, university rector, he publicly criticized the cancellation, called it a kind of tribalism that actually harms the Palestinian cause.
And how was that received?
Well, Oktay Searle, who's a chief advisor to the president, hit back really hard. Openly questioned Bostancha's concern for Lynette, even demanded his resignation and an investigation into his comments.
Wow, that's intense. That's a strong internal reaction.
It really is. And then, adding another layer, it came out that Nasi Bostancha also writes for Shalom Gazetesi.
The newspaper for Turkey's Jewish community.
Exactly. And that reveal apparently caused significant outrage in some pro-government circles. And it echoes past incidents, like Özlem Zengin, the AKP deputy chair in parliament, facing criticism just for congratulating Sharon in a tweet. Shows how sensitive any perceived link is.
But then, interestingly, a recent video came out showing Lynette herself strongly condemning Israel's actions in Gaza.
Right, which adds crucial nuance, doesn't it? Challenges that simple portrayal of her as just representing the Israeli government line.
Definitely.
And the commentator makes a really important point here. They stress the diversity of opinion within Israel itself.
Yeah, that often gets overlooked.
Including big protests in Israel against their own government, especially over Palestinian children's deaths. So they strongly criticize the protesters who targeted Lynette just because she's Israeli and Jewish.
Ignoring her actual views.
Completely ignoring her stated views, ignoring the broader, complex reality.
The commentator also points out what they see as hypocrisy, right?
Yeah.
Protesting an individual artist while maintaining trade relations with the country itself.
Yeah, they bring that up directly, mentioning the oil still flowing from Azerbaijan via Aliyev to Israel as a clear example. And they argue that targeting Lynette, who's lived in Turkey long-term, is a Turkish citizen, and holding her responsible for the Israeli government's actions just because she's Jewish. Well, that's fundamentally unjust.
So the commentator feels these reactions lack depth.
Yes, they argue they lack critical thinking. They don't properly consider the consequences of the protests or even how these actions might actually help Palestinians.
Right.
They contrast it with, say, genuine criticism of the Israeli government coming from Jewish individuals or groups worldwide whose voices can actually be really impactful.
So the commentator's final word on this is
that equating all Israelis or all Jewish people with the specific actions of the current Israeli government. Well, it comes from ignorance, maybe even a kind of comfortable refusal to engage with complexity, with nuance. It's a rejection of those broad, simplistic labels for whole groups of people.
You know what this whole deep dive really seems to highlight across all these different topics is maybe the danger of boiling down complex issues, complex identities into overly simple boxes.
Absolutely. And the vital importance of actually seeking out and engaging with more nuanced perspectives, more comprehensive views.
Yeah. Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From small language issues to potential constitutional shifts and these big cultural flashpoints.
Yeah.
Our aim, as always, has just been to give you, the listener, some clarity, hopefully some much-needed context on these really important, often complicated issues shaping Turkey right now.
Which kind of leads us to a final thought, maybe a question for you to mull over.
Okay.
Given this wide, diverse range of opinions and actions we see even within specific national or religious groups, how can we, as individuals, as societies, maybe move beyond those simplistic, often misleading categories? How do we engage more thoughtfully, more effectively, with the real complexities of international issues and the diverse views of the people involved?